Night falls over Moscow like a funeral shroud. The air reeks of smoke and iron, the Kremlin bells tolling as if warning the living to hold their breath. Inside the Tsar's private chambers, a father and son stand inches apart. The father, Ivan IV, crowned as the first Tsar of all the Russias, grips his staff with white-knuckled fury. His heir, the gentle Tsarevich Ivan, dares to speak of mercy for a battered pregnant wife. A single blow delivered in rage will echo for centuries. By dawn, the dynasty's future lies bleeding on the cold stone floor. If the shadows of power, madness, and history pull you in, stay with us. Like this video, subscribe for more stories where the line between ruler and monster disappears into the dark. Moscow, 1530. The summer air was thick with incense and candle smoke as the bells of the Kremlin rang out to announce the birth of a son to Grand Prince Vasily III and his young wife, Elena Glinskaya. To the superstitious, the cries of the infant echoed like a prophecy. This boy, named Ivan, was destined to inherit the vast and fractured lands of Rus. Yet his cradle was less a sanctuary than a battlefield. Barely 3 years later, Vasily was dead. His widow, Elena, fought to secure her child's throne, wielding power with the steel will of a woman surrounded by wolves. But court politics in 16th century Moscow was not a game of loyalty. It was a blood sport. Rumors swirled that Elena herself was poisoned, struck down by boyars who could not stomach a woman's rule. With her death, Ivan, not yet 8 years old, was left at the mercy of men who feasted on power like carrion birds. The boy who should have been wrapped in royal protection instead lived like a neglected orphan. The court reduced him to a symbol useful but disposable. Servants ignored his needs. Nobles mocked him openly. Some historians record that young Ivan often roamed the Kremlin corridors half-starved, clothes torn, scavenging like a stray. Others say he was forced to watch as courtiers murdered those loyal to his mother, their bodies dragged across the palace floors while he stood trembling in silence. What happens to a child who learns that trust is fatal? Ivan's heart hardened early. He studied the Psalms and saints by candlelight, but the scripture mixed with images of cruelty and betrayal. Even as a boy, he fed ravens by throwing live animals from the walls of the Kremlin, an echo of violence learned, not invented. The seeds of terror had been planted in soil rich with neglect. Yet, despite his isolation, Ivan was no ordinary child. His mind was sharp, restless, and voracious. He devoured chronicles of past rulers, studied the Byzantine emperors, and dreamed of a Russia united under one throne. To him, power was not a privilege but armor against humiliation. By his teenage years, he had already resolved never to be a puppet, never again to feel the sting of helplessness he had endured as a boy. There's a haunting question here. Did Russia create Ivan the Terrible, or did Ivan create himself in response to Russia's cruelty? Perhaps both are true. The child who wandered the halls of the Kremlin alone would one day become the man who made all of Russia tremble. But for now, he was still a boy, half prince, half prisoner. And the night would come when his childhood ended with a blaze of fire that devoured Moscow itself. In the Russian winter of 1547, Moscow burned. Flames swallowed streets, churches, and homes, turning the city into a furnace of ash and screams. The blaze raged for days, killing thousands, leaving the survivors wandering among charred beams and blackened corpses. Whispers ran through the smoke that this was God's punishment for Ivan, newly crowned Tsar at just 17. It was not the first time Ivan had tasted fire. The boy who had grown up surrounded by betrayal saw in this inferno both omen and opportunity. Standing above the ruins, he understood what the people now demanded: a savior who could end the cycle of chaos. The boyars, those feudal lords who had tormented him as a child, were despised. The peasants prayed for a ruler who would crush them. And Ivan, with his haunting eyes and iron voice, stepped into that role with terrifying conviction. But to see how this fire shaped him, we must step back again. Before the coronation, before the crown, Ivan had endured years of humiliation. He was treated less as a prince than as a pawn. The boyars feasted in banquet halls while Ivan sat ignored, clutching scraps. He watched his beloved younger brother, Yuri, mocked for his disabilities. He grew to understand that weakness, whether physical, emotional, or political, was not forgiven in this world. It was destroyed. These experiences carved something jagged in his soul. As a boy, he began practicing cruelty like a ritual. He tortured animals, staged mock executions, and tested how much power he could wield over servants. It was not senseless violence, it was rehearsal. In Ivan's mind, every act was preparation for the day when he would reverse the balance of fear. When Elena Glinskaya's regency collapsed, factions of boyars devoured one another, each grasping for power while young Ivan looked on. It taught him the oldest lesson of Russian politics. Loyalty was fleeting, but terror was eternal. And so, the boy grew into a teenager already determined to wield fear as a weapon. At his coronation, he did something no ruler before him had dared. He crowned himself Tsar of all the Russias. Not Grand Prince, not ruler among nobles, but Tsar, heir to the Byzantine Caesars, chosen by God. The message was unmistakable. Ivan would bow to no one. The boyars, who had sneered at him since childhood, would no longer be his masters. The fire of 1547 became both symbol and catalyst. To the survivors, it was proof that God demanded change. To Ivan, it was confirmation that destiny had set him apart, surrounded him with flames, and called him to rule with an iron hand. He was only 17, but he had already decided that mercy would never be his throne's foundation. The prophecy whispered at his birth that Ivan was chosen was now a reality. But chosen for what? To unite Russia? To protect it? Or to drag it into an age of fear and blood? History would provide the answer, but only after Moscow wept. For a brief moment in his early reign, Ivan seemed touched by grace. The coronation had filled him with purpose, and the horrors of his childhood appeared to have sharpened, not broken, his will. At 17, he had married Anastasia Romanovna, a gentle noblewoman whose patience and warmth softened the dark corners of his heart. Under her influence, Ivan's Russia began to glimpse something rare: justice. The young Tsar called for reforms that astonished his subjects. He reorganized the military, curbing the power of feudal lords. He created a council of chosen advisors, the Chosen Council, whose duty was to guide him with reason rather than flattery. He summoned assemblies where nobles and commoners alike could present grievances. For a time, it seemed as if Russia had been given not a tyrant, but a visionary. And Ivan believed it. He believed he could be both Caesar and shepherd, ruler by divine right but protector by conscience. His sermons to the court spoke of a Russia united under God, where corruption would be punished and the weak defended. The boy who once starved in the Kremlin now demanded bread for his people. The child mocked by boyars now lectured those same nobles about duty and morality. Yet beneath this golden vision, the shadows remained. Ivan's paranoia never truly left him. It lingered like smoke after a fire, invisible but choking. He remembered every slight from his boyhood, every insult, every withheld meal. He kept lists of names, those who had mocked or ignored him, and he nurtured his hatred like embers waiting to flare. His reforms may have been born of idealism, but they were also weapons, designed to strip the boyars of their old power and bind all authority to the Tsar alone. Still, Russia benefited. Roads were repaired, trade routes opened. The church was compelled to obey the crown. Moscow was no longer just a city of fires and conspiracies. It was becoming the seat of a true empire. And at the center stood Ivan and Anastasia, a couple who embodied hope. He fierce and commanding, she gentle and devout. Together, they gave the impression of balance, iron tempered by mercy. But fate is cruel to rulers who believe they have mastered it. In 1553, Ivan fell deathly ill, barely 23 years old. He lay in his chambers, fever burning through his body, convinced that God was calling him to account. He summoned his nobles and demanded they swear loyalty to his infant son Dmitri, the heir who could barely toddle. The boyars hesitated. Some refused outright. Ivan, delirious with fever, watched the masks drop. The loyalty they professed was shallow, the ambition beneath it sharp as a knife. Miraculously, Ivan recovered, but he was no longer the same man. The brush with death convinced him that betrayal lived in every shadow, waiting for weakness. And he had seen with his own eyes how the nobles schemed even as he lay gasping for breath. The lesson carved itself into his soul. Trust no one, forgive nothing. Anastasia, his wife, did what she could to hold him steady. Her presence soothed his storms. Her patience drew him back from the edge. But she could not erase the memory of that fever, nor the suspicion it planted. Ivan had peered into the abyss of mortality, and when he rose from his bed, he carried that abyss inside him. For now, though Russia still walked in sunlight, the Tsar still dreamed of reform, of empire, of glory. But already, in the chambers of his mind, shadows were gathering. The years after Ivan's recovery revealed both his brilliance and his unraveling. He had seen his nobles hesitate to swear loyalty to his infant son, and that hesitation became a wound that never healed. Though he returned to his throne, his faith in the boyars was dead. He would govern Russia not through trust, but through fear. Still, Russia prospered for a time. Ivan expanded the army and set his eyes on conquest. The Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, remnants of the Mongol yoke that had once enslaved Rus, fell under his relentless campaigns. When Kazan fell in 1552, the victory was hailed as divine. The walls of Moscow thundered with celebration, and Ivan was carried through the city as a hero chosen by God. He had broken the eastern frontier, opened the Volga, and declared Russia a power not merely of survival, but of destiny. The Tsar ordered the construction of a cathedral to commemorate the victory, one unlike any the world had ever seen. Its spires twisted toward heaven in a blaze of color and shape, each dome a flame frozen in stone. This was St. Basil's Cathedral, still standing today, its surreal beauty a monument both to Ivan's triumph and his obsession with glory. But while stone monuments endured, human bonds began to wither. Ivan's victories demanded blood. Thousands of Russian soldiers perished in the fields, while peasants bore the weight of endless taxation. His hunger for expansion pulled men from their homes, leaving villages empty and children starving. Ivan justified it all as service to God, as the price of empire. Yet, in the silence of those villages, seeds of resentment grew. And then came the greatest blow of all. Anastasia, the wife who had tempered Ivan's darkness, fell ill in 1560. At first, it seemed a fever like any other, but within days she wasted away. Some whispered it was poison. Ivan himself was certain of it. He accused the boyars, convinced they had murdered her to weaken him. When Anastasia died, Ivan's grief was volcanic. He screamed, wept, and then turned cold, the warmth of his early reign buried with her in the grave. From that moment, Russia's Tsar was never the same. The tenderness Anastasia had nurtured in him withered. Love, trust, hope, these became words of mockery. He remembered again the cruelty of his boyhood, the betrayals of his fever, and now the death of his beloved wife. To Ivan, there was no longer such a thing as accident or fate. There was only treachery, and treachery must be punished. The Oprichnina was born from this madness. A private army of black-clad riders, loyal only to Ivan, they became his instruments of terror. Their mission was simple, to root out traitors wherever they hid. Boyars, priests, peasants, it made no difference. The Oprichniki swept across Russia like a shadow, dragging families from their homes, torturing confessions from the innocent, leaving heads on pikes as warnings. Ivan watched it all with the conviction of a man certain that God's hand guided his cruelty. He had seen betrayal since childhood, and now he would preempt it with fear. Mercy, in his eyes, was weakness. Suspicion was strength. Russia trembled, and the Tsar who once promised justice became the very thing he had feared most. A man who trusted nothing but violence. The boy who had once stood small and trembling in the Kremlin was gone. In his place stood Ivan the Terrible. By the late 1570s, Ivan's reign was no longer a promise but a nightmare. Russia groaned beneath his Oprichnina. Villages lay in ruins, their people scattered or dead. The black-cloaked horsemen who had once been symbols of loyalty now became harbingers of dread. Wherever they rode, screams followed. Ivan had grown older, but not gentler. His beard streaked with gray. His back stooped from years of tension. Yet his eyes burned with the same merciless fire that had carried him from boy to Tsar. Paranoia consumed him. He saw plots in every smile, poison in every cup, betrayal in every word. The memory of Anastasia's death was still raw, like a wound that refused to close. He cursed the boyars, cursed his advisors, cursed even the church when it dared question him. And yet, amid this darkness, there was still one person Ivan loved without suspicion. His eldest son, the Tsarevich Ivan. The heir shared his father's name, but not his father's cruelty. The younger Ivan was known for his gentleness, his devotion to his wife, and his concern for the people. Where the father ruled with terror, the son spoke of mercy. Their bond was complex. The father admired his son's strength of spirit, but in his darkest moments he also resented it. The court itself felt the tension. Advisors whispered that the Tsarevich would be a different ruler, that he might undo his father's terror when the throne passed to him. These whispers, half hope, half fear, drifted back to Ivan. And once heard, they could never be unheard. By 1581, the air in Moscow had grown thick with dread. The Tsar was in one of his rages, prowling the palace halls, his staff clutched in his hands as though it were an extension of his fury. His daughter-in-law, the wife of the Tsarevich, had been beaten by Ivan in one of his fits of anger. Some say she had worn clothes he deemed immodest. Others insist she was punished for speaking too boldly. Either way, she was pregnant, and the blows caused her to miscarry. When the Tsarevich learned what had happened, he stormed into his father's chambers, his voice shaking with outrage. No courtier dared intervene. Father and son faced one another, the air between them thick with unspoken years of love, anger, pride, and disappointment. The Tsarevich accused him of cruelty, of recklessness, of destroying his own family. Ivan's eyes widened with fury. His staff rose in his hands. Words failed. Violence spoke. The blow fell with a sickening crack. Staff against skull. A gasp echoed through the chamber. The Tsarevich staggered, blood pouring down his temple. His hands reached toward his father, not in anger, but in desperation, as though begging for the love that had always eluded him. Ivan's rage vanished in an instant. The sight of his son's blood broke him. He threw himself upon the Tsarevich, crying out in horror, pressing his robe against the wound as if he could undo what he had done. Witnesses swore they had never seen the Tsar weep so violently. But the wound was mortal. Days later, the heir was dead. That single strike destroyed not just a man, but a dynasty. The palace fell silent. The court whispered. Russia held its breath. The Tsar, who had crushed armies, conquered khanates, and terrorized his people, had now murdered his own future. The man who ruled a nation had destroyed his bloodline with one moment of rage. The death of the Tsarevich was not merely a family tragedy. It was a catastrophe that shook the very foundations of the Russian state. For days, the Kremlin became a mausoleum. The corridors, usually alive with intrigue and whispers, fell into a heavy silence. Courtiers tiptoed through the halls, their faces pale, their eyes averted. No one dared speak of what had happened, yet everyone knew. The Tsar had slain his heir. Ivan himself was a wreck. Witnesses described him clutching his son's lifeless body, rocking back and forth as though he were a child again, stripped of his crown, stripped of his authority, stripped even of his reason. He screamed at God for allowing it. He begged forgiveness from the son who could no longer hear. He raged at the boyars, convinced they had driven a wedge between father and son. But in the stillness of his chamber, when the echo of his own cries died away, Ivan knew the truth. The blame was his alone. This was not the fury of the battlefield, nor the calculated cruelty of the Oprichnina. This was a moment of madness, an eruption of violence that consumed not just a man but the future of a dynasty. The Tsarevich had been more than an heir. He had been the last hope that Russia might one day be ruled by a gentler hand. In his death, that hope was extinguished. The people of Moscow mourned quietly, but their grief carried the sharp edge of fear. If a father could murder his son, what protection did anyone else have? Rumors spread like frost across the city. Some whispered that God had cursed Ivan, that his throne was stained with blood beyond redemption. Others said the devil himself had entered the Tsar's soul. Priests preached caution, but even the church could not soften the horror of what had transpired. And Ivan, broken, hollowed, haunted, wandered the palace like a ghost. He attended the funeral in black robes, his face pale, his hands trembling. Chroniclers record that he wept openly, that he struck his chest and declared his guilt before all assembled. Yet even as the tears fell, his paranoia never loosened its grip. He continued to see enemies in every shadow, convinced that his son's death was not a result of his own temper, but of plots that surrounded him. The dynastic consequences were immediate. With the Tsarevich dead, the line of succession was thrown into chaos. Ivan's surviving son, Fifer, was gentle and pious but weak, unsuited to rule. The strong, capable heir, the one who might have secured the Rurikid dynasty, was gone. A single blow, struck in rage, had shattered a dynasty that traced its blood back to the Viking princes who had first ruled Rus. This was the hinge upon which Russian history turned. For years, Ivan had been the terror of his people, but the state endured because it had an heir. Now the state was exposed, vulnerable, trembling at the edge of a precipice. And Ivan knew it. His sorrow was real, his guilt crushing, but it did not soften him. Instead, it drove him deeper into suspicion, deeper into cruelty, deeper into the abyss. He lashed out at courtiers, demanded purges, tightened his grip on a land already suffocating. It was as if he believed that if he could not control the future through his son, he would control it through fear. But no fear could undo what had been done. In the stillness of those nights, when the palace lay silent and Moscow's fires had burned low, Ivan sat alone, the ghost of his son always near. Chroniclers wrote of him muttering prayers until his voice broke, then falling into fits of weeping that shook his body like storms. It was the one enemy he could never destroy, his own memory. That night in 1581 was more than a quarrel. It was the moment the dynasty's bloodline began to die, and with it, the seed of Russia's coming chaos was sown. When the bells tolled for the Tsarevich's funeral, they rang not only for a prince but for the end of certainty in Russia. The Rurikid line, descended from Viking chieftains who had ruled Rus for centuries, was now reduced to a fragile thread. Ivan's surviving son, Fifer, was pious and soft-spoken, but his spirit was no match for the storm that swirled around him. Where the Tsarevich had embodied strength, Fifer embodied silence. And silence was deadly in an empire that lived and died on the will of its ruler. Ivan knew it. The blow he had struck had not just robbed him of a son but robbed Russia of a future. His guilt, however, never blossomed into restraint. If anything, it hardened into madness. In his last years, Ivan alternated between penitence and fury, between moments of prayer where he begged forgiveness and violent purges where he demanded obedience. He dressed himself in black robes like a monk, fasting, praying, then rising to order new executions before returning to the chapel to weep. His subjects saw a man no longer fully of this world, half ruler, half penitent, wholly unpredictable. The people whispered that God had abandoned him, and perhaps they were right. For after the death of the Tsarevich, Russia's fate unraveled swiftly. When Ivan died in 1584, he left the throne to Fifer, a man utterly unprepared to rule. Fifer was kind, devout, and beloved for his gentleness, but he lacked the will to govern. Power slipped from his hands into those of his brother-in-law, Boris Godunov, whose ambitions outpaced his legitimacy. The cracks widened into chasms. Famines swept across the land. Fields lay barren, villages emptied, corpses piled along roadsides as peasants starved. The dynastic question, who was meant to rule Russia, became a blade cutting through the nation. Pretenders rose, claiming to be long-lost heirs, false Dimitris, who promised salvation and drew desperate followers. Civil war erupted, foreign armies marched across borders, and the time of troubles began. All of it, the famine, the pretenders, the invasions, could be traced back to that single night in 1581 when Ivan's staff met his son's skull. Without the Tsarevich, the Rurikid dynasty was doomed. Russia, unmoored and leaderless, became prey to chaos. Contemporaries struggled to make sense of it. Was Ivan cursed from childhood, abandoned by his mother and tormented by boyars until cruelty became his only shield? Or was his dynasty cursed by his own hand, the blood of his son staining not just his reign but the very soil of Russia? Priests thundered from pulpits that the nation's suffering was divine punishment. Peasants muttered that the Tsar's soul had been damned long before he died. Nobles, ever pragmatic, jockeyed for survival, carving power from the empire's broken body. The truth is simpler and darker. Ivan's rage did not only kill his heir, it killed the stability of Russia itself. The boy who had once dreamed of uniting Russia had, in the end, undone it with his own hand. And the people of Russia would wander through famine, war, and betrayal before they would ever see stability again. The years following Ivan's death were a landscape of uncertainty and terror. Fifer's weak rule left Russia exposed, a kingdom governed not by a strong hand but by fear of what might come. Boris Godunov, the brother-in-law, became the de facto ruler, manipulating the fragile heir while consolidating power for himself. The dynastic vacuum ignited ambitions far and wide. Pretenders emerged from the shadows like smoke after a fire. The false Dmitris claimed to be the dead Tsarevich returned, invoking loyalty among those desperate for stability. Nobles and peasants alike rallied to their banners, driven not by certainty but by hope and hunger. Wars erupted between claimants, each battle leaving villages burned, children orphaned, and rivers choked with bodies. The people had lived through Ivan's terror, and now they were trapped in the chaos his rage had set loose. Famine spread like a plague. Crops failed under the weight of mismanagement and incessant wars. Winter winds cut across empty fields, carrying with them the stench of unburied corpses. Survivors scavenged forests for roots and bark, haunted by the echoes of the fires Ivan had once commanded. The empire he had once expanded now seemed smaller, shriveled by the weight of loss and mistrust. Even the church, which had long provided a moral compass, faltered. Monks and priests preached, prayed, and condemned, but their words could not staunch the hemorrhage of power. The Oprichnina, once Ivan's instrument of control, had vanished with his death, leaving nothing but a memory of black horses and terror. Russia had learned to fear absolute power, but in its absence, it floundered like a ship adrift without a captain. The time of troubles, as historians later called it, became a crucible in which Russia's destiny was reforged, but at a terrible cost. Tens of thousands perished in battles and famines. Families fractured. Loyalty became a currency no longer honored, and betrayal thrived in its place. Every peasant, noble, and soldier knew the fragility of life under men who wielded power like a blade. And yet, amid the suffering, Ivan's legacy endured. His reign had reshaped Russia irrevocably. He had shown the price of unchecked authority, the power of fear, and the danger of a single act of rage. He had expanded the empire's borders and built monuments that would outlast centuries. Yet in the process, he had sown the seeds of decay that nearly destroyed it. It is tempting to ask whether history would have been kinder if the Tsarevich had lived. Would the Rurikid line have endured, bringing stability and reform? Or would Russia, even under a gentler ruler, have faced the same tumult? We cannot know. All we can see is that the night Ivan struck his son was not merely a family tragedy. It was the pivot point on which the fate of an empire turned. That night, Moscow and all of Russia learned a lesson the Tsar had always known but had never fully understood. Power is fragile, blood is fragile, and the future of a nation can vanish in a single, unthinking moment. Centuries have passed since Ivan's hand ended his dynasty, yet his presence lingers in Russian memory like a shadow that refuses to fade. Portraits depict him as stern, regal, sometimes cruel. Legends whisper of his fits of rage, his merciless Oprichniki, and the bloody halls of the Kremlin. Poets, historians, and playwrights have all tried to capture him. Yet the man remains elusive, almost spectral, part history, part myth. The truth and the legend intertwine. Some accounts paint him as a visionary ruler, a man who unified fragmented lands, extended Russia's borders, and built monuments that still inspire awe. Others emphasize the terror, the merciless purges, the blood of innocent and guilty alike spilled at his command. Yet both visions are true. Ivan was a man shaped by suffering, forged in violence, and consumed by paranoia. He embodied the paradox of power. It could create and destroy in equal measure, often simultaneously. Stories grew in the telling. Children were warned that Ivan's ghost might appear in the Kremlin corridors, that his rage had not left the earth with his body. Some claim his spirit haunted the stones of St. Basil's Cathedral, pacing between the onion domes, a silent witness to the nation he had remade in his own image. Chroniclers of later centuries recast his violence as moral lesson, political allegory, even divine punishment. He became more than a man. He became a symbol, a caution, a mirror reflecting the extremes to which humans could bend under absolute authority. Artists and writers seized the terror and tragedy of his life. Painters immortalized him with piercing eyes that seemed to follow viewers across centuries. Dramatists crafted tales where the Tsar's private fury mirrored the public suffering of his people. And yet, through all the exaggerations and reinterpretations, there remains the unalterable truth. Ivan's rage, his paranoia, and his single, fatal blow against his own son reshaped the destiny of Russia. He was a man who could build empires and monuments, yet could also, in a fleeting moment, destroy his own legacy. Even today, his story resonates because it speaks to the fragility of power and the human condition. It asks uncomfortable questions. Can greatness exist without cruelty? Does mercy weaken the throne? And perhaps most haunting of all, how often does a single act of violence, born of anger, irrevocably alter the course of history? Ivan's life was a warning, but also a fascination. It reminds us that rulers are not infallible, that destiny can be overturned by a single night, a single blow, a single human flaw magnified by circumstance. And perhaps that is why he endures in memory, not as a monster or a saint, but as a man who embodied the terrifying complexity of power itself. The Tsar who struck his son became more than a man. He became a story told across generations. His life and reign are studied in history books, whispered in legends, and dramatized in theater. Yet despite the passage of centuries, the central tragedy remains vivid. The moment when Ivan's rage obliterated the line of succession and cast Russia into turmoil. It is a moment that defines him as much as his victories, his conquests, or his reforms. People often ask whether Ivan was a monster or a victim. Perhaps he was both. The boy who wandered the halls of the Kremlin in rags, starved and mocked, grew into a man haunted by betrayal and loss. The fire of his childhood, the fever of his youth, and the death of his beloved wife all fused to create a ruler both brilliant and terrible. He exemplifies the duality of human nature, capable of grandeur and atrocity, creation and destruction, mercy and fury. His story also shaped the nation he ruled. Russia, once fragmented and vulnerable, had become an empire, a kingdom capable of expansion and resilience. Yet the instability that followed his son's death, the famine, the pretenders, the time of troubles, revealed the fragility of dynastic rule and the heavy cost of absolute power mismanaged. Ivan's reign, therefore, is remembered not only for its terror but for its consequences. A blueprint of both strength and peril that would echo in Russian history for generations. Legends grew around his final years, tales of a haunted Tsar wandering empty palaces, praying endlessly, tormented by visions of his son. Some chroniclers claim he could not sleep for the screams that haunted him. Others report that he often struck objects in fits of guilt, the weight of his sin pressing on him like a tangible force. Whether true or exaggerated, these accounts reveal a man who understood, at least too late, the full scope of his actions. Centuries later, historians still debate Ivan's legacy. Was he the savior of Russia who had unified and expanded it? Or the architect of suffering, whose single night of rage destroyed the dynasty and brought famine and chaos? The answer is neither simple nor absolute. His life reminds us that power is a mirror, reflecting both the potential and the darkness within those who wield it. Ivan the Terrible endures in our imagination because he forces us to confront the consequences of human flaw magnified by authority. Ultimately, the tragedy of Ivan is the tragedy of history itself. How ambition, fear, and anger can converge to reshape a nation, how the life of one man can determine the fate of millions, and how even the most powerful ruler cannot escape the human cost of his own choices. His story is immortal because it is a warning, a lesson, and a legend all at once. And as we walk through the ruins of empires, the echoes of Moscow's Kremlin, and the shadows of onion-domed cathedrals, we are reminded. History is not made by the righteous alone, nor destroyed by the wicked alone, but by the fragile, violent, and unforgettable humanity of those who rule.